sound for this.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 42 of the Unchained Vodcast. Today, we are with our special guest, CSE Max, to talk about lore. How's it going, Max?
It's going great. I'm here as a guest on the Unchained Vodcast and excited to talk about lore.
Good. Awesome. And pretty much everyone that is here is a... I don't know how much of a lore buff Kriss is, so I won't speak for him. But we're all role players. Play tabletop games and MMOs as well, of course. So it's something we're definitely very interested in, and I think I'm the guild leader for Ordo Veritas, of course. But before that, all my official activity in guilds has generally been as head of roleplay.
Okay.
So lots of MMORP.
Let's say for CU, I'm a lore buff by default because I have to translate all the becoming stories.
Right. So
You're
you
required.
better enjoy it.
Yes.
That's got to be a difficult thing to translate too.
It's extremely difficult because, contrary to a technical document, there are some very literary specific and language specific sentence constructions that are really hard to translate in other languages.
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting problem often enough. I talked to Apollon a lot, who kind of heads up the volunteer translator team, or at least on the German side, and sometimes get into involved conversations about very, very specific nuances of words.
Or actual words like the war bands and the orders and the battle groups, trying to find a good translation for that.
Well, I mean, in this case in particular, as I said in the update, the translation teams did twice the work in half the time. So bravo. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah. But the lore for them is also interesting because since we're on the topic of lore, the war bands is actually, as much as I'm a conservative on the terms for the groups, for the guilds, for things like that. It's just a force of habit. But when you actually do the work to search for a translation for the war bands, you realize that it's actually a historical military unit.
Yep.
So it is interesting that there is lore behind that. Is not just for the battle group, there's always the two sides: the ones that think that it's too much of a modern term, and the ones that just wanted to call them the raids.
Right. Well, yes, Mark chose the term warband very deliberately.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to go right into it then. I didn't mean to segue us over to translation, but it's still an interesting topic, at least, especially with regards to lore. But to get us started, I did want to kind of field a bit of a softball for everyone to get us in the mood of thinking about lore and the stories and looking at some of the existing lore. And again, as always, all of our questions are for pretty much for both of you and for chat as well. But I kind of wonder, what is everyone's favorite part of the existing lore? Like favorite story, I guess.
Well, that's a softball question.
I'm a bit biased because I'm gonna play a Pict. I like the becoming story of the Picts, but I also like
that one's two parts, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I also very much like the Kaichi becoming story.
The Ketchi?
Yeah.
Interesting. You're an Arthurian, I take it.
Yes. I am. Well, the others are interesting. The one that I haven't finished reading it because there's quite a few parts to it. It's for the golems.
Yeah.
I really like the take on the creation and the self-determination of the race in the becoming story, but I need to finish reading them.
Well, I'm glad you. I'm glad of that. I think you should, as you read it, or perhaps afterward, the backer Foggy wrote a kind of an essay or research paper on the themes in the Golem story.
I remember seeing that.
And that's on the forums. I won't say how much he got right, but I considered it very, very interesting reading.
It's very well written
as an analysis, and he actually ferreted out a lot of the themes that story in particular, the Golem story, is connected to. I think now the Golem story, it's 3 parts. And they're all pretty lengthy. I think that's the longest, story that was like totally original to me, in the sense of, not taking something Mark wrote and running with it, but something that, that I started with and wrote.
So for the Golems, you got it from start to finish.
Yes.
That was you from, okay.
And same with the Picts.
Okay.
The Ketchi, Ketchi, a different story. I think I can't remember, but I think the Golems might have been the first story where that was the case. In my since I started working at CSE.
When you joined, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm not positive of that, but I think it might have been. Now, to answer the original softball question, this is actually the kind of question that I dread, because I find it so hard to answer.
Because you're not going to like any of your stories, as usual.
Well, I know after the fact, but I feel like when I'm in order to write, excuse me, in order to write a story, I have to feel like it's my favorite, at least while I'm working on it. And then later I can say, well, this one's better than that one, or I wish I'd done this a little bit differently, and obsess over it forever. But at least when I'm writing it, it has to feel like my favorite one. I feel like maybe my favorite stories are the 3 Giants stories, the Fearbog, the Golems, and the Frost Giants, or Jotnar. But that changes. Certainly, those are the ones that I think of first when I think of what are the favorite stories that I've worked on for CU.
Cool. We've got in chat, let's see, Berserker, Valkyrie, Ufitnar, Golem, Furbog. A lot of Becoming stories. Of course, that's a bulk of what we have. I do believe, Dennis mentioned the depths. For me, I had to actually think about this for a while, because I will be honest, it has been a while since I've read most of the lore stories. But I'm pretty sure my favorite one has been the Gargoyles. Primarily because of the description and the atmosphere of the stories really appealed to me. I found them the most enjoyable to read compared to a lot of the other ones. Not saying I didn't like the other ones, but I just really enjoyed reading through that one.
Well, that's what favorite means.
It probably varies depending on who's talking. Let's see. I'm going to try to grab questions as I can and as they fit with our list. I did want to grab one here just because I have no idea what he's talking about here, so I'm going to throw it to you. Where did it go? From Rec. Are you at all familiar with the stories describing TDD where it almost sounds as if they arrive on what could be construed as spaceships?
Oh, in the folklore.
I'm assuming, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes. The children of Danu is what, or the people of the goddess Danu is what Tuahadadanan means. whether you want to interpret it that way or not, we're aware of them a lot. I mean, there's a lot of research that goes into these stories, and then, we throw a lot of it out. Or if it doesn't get thrown out exactly, it gets molded into stories that aren't exactly like our twist on them, but stories that are the world of Camelot Unchained stories.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of that more straight, well, honestly, some of the TDD lore, in the real world folklore, is some really weird stuff. But
the actual lore
these...
for it, yeah, I've I've heard some stories. Well, it's the British. Well, it's the Irish, to be precise.
Right.
Irish, Welsh, and they have some pretty weird folklore.
Yeah. But then so do the Norse, and there are certainly plenty of Brittonic weirdness that can be found.
Oh yeah, I think most of the ancient civilizations, folklore and myths, can be pretty weird at times.
Mm-hmm.
There's a pretty wide mix of unusual things happening in a lot of different mythologies.
Yeah.
And
you go into Greek, you get some...
yeah, well, we do have the Hamadryads, which are Greek. But I want to say, in terms of that stuff specifically about spaceships, we may not have spaceships in our game, much to the sadness of people like JB. But those themes and those kinds of ideas do influence the lore for Camelot Unchained in various ways. And I mean, if you want to think about that, I would say take a look at the Emissaries.
I was about to say, they're kind of
story and lore.
That could kind of be construed that way a little bit. You could just throw like a weird rock formation that oddly looks like a UFO somewhere on the world, and
well,
people will speculate for ages.
Like ships, then I would recommend the Dvergar story.
Oh,
now let's see.
I haven't read this one yet.
I did want to try to get Oldovic's question here.
Sure.
I thought it was a good one for chat as well, particularly to wonder if anyone reading some of these lore, some of these stories, has made them change their planned mains. Because I actually know a few, like I know when the Picts came out, a few people changed from what they wanted to do. I think Kriss might have been one of them.
Yeah, I'm still debating, because right now the Picts is the more fleshed out in terms of gameplay. So that's why I veered on this one. But my initial pick was the Storm Riders, because before the lore for the Picts came out, that was one of my favorite lore. All this around the Veil and all that rite of passage, was really interesting. So I might go back to Storm Riders when more gameplay and more stats come out on the race. But at the moment, when the Picts came out, both the visual and the becoming story made me change my my desired race.
I've really got to get to the Storm Riders story. What they have is really more of a vision description from what Buck wrote way back when, and not really a proper becoming story. That one's a bit of a challenge, though, because there is so much description of how they are today that it's a little hard to tell a becoming tale about them that includes all of that. And so that's a challenge for me.
Are you still working on rewriting some becoming stories, or are they all behind you for now?
I'm still working on rewriting something. I'm currently in the midst of publishing a new rewritten section of the Silverhands Becoming story.
Yeah, you were working on those
every month.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So part 6 is coming out probably next week.
Cool.
Nice.
And of course, I just mentioned I've got to get to the Storm Riders.
I'm looking forward to this one.
For me, it's not going to change my my preference on race or class.
You like your you like your butt wings.
I like my butt wings, but it will change my. It will possibly change my RP character when the game actually comes out and a roleplay in game. The lore of the race is gonna. I already have like a story because we were doing some forum RP and stuff for a while, but the lore of the race may change that entirely. So,
cool.
I did want to ask, transitioning a bit. I did want to ask about the lore making process a bit. In particular, how do you decide what to write?
I mean, had you asked me early on, years ago, I would have given a different answer than I would give now, because it's evolved. These days, I pretty much pick. There's a lot of things that go into deciding on what to work on next. Many of them aren't particularly interesting things to talk about, like how much time do I have? What else am I working on? Generally speaking, for like a new Becoming story, there's a pitch process that I go through, and this is mostly self-imposed. But I'll write like an outline of a story, a proposed story, and give it to Mark and get his feedback, and then change it. And then when he approves of that, then I write the story. He reads it before and makes changes or asks me to rewrite sections of it or something before it gets published. Does that kind of answer your question?
It does. And from that, a similar sort of topic, I've noticed that some things seem to come, or to some degree anyway, from Mark. So is there any kind of division on what sort of things that he actually works writing on versus you, or is it just kind of whoever is feeling inspired about something? Or
yeah, there's not really much of a clear division. Mark likes to talk about how he's like a storyteller. So sometimes, often it'll be that he'll get inspired, have an idea, work on something, create a kind of draft of it or a rough draft, and at some point when he's happy with how it is, it'll hand it off to me, and then I'll like take the ball and run with it. There hasn't been as much time as we've been pushing for the first phase of beta, called Beta 1, to focus as much on lore as there has been in the past. Yeah. So there's been a little bit less of that and a little more, Max, do your lore thing. We have other stuff to worry about. So keep that ship sailing.
Right. Speaking a bit on that also, did you or do you have sometimes ideas for a race based on the Become story, on a story you have in your head that you try to pitch for a new race, for example? Has it happened, or like a new race, you have the story in your head that comes with a different race? Do you have the liberty to pitch the race to Mark and to the art team, maybe, to come up with the visual based on the story rather than the story coming from the design of the race? That's what I mean.
Yes. It's a very open studio, so I mean, really anybody who has an idea is free to pitch it to Mark. I have done so on occasion, and was assigned to come up with some ideas for races at a certain point. But none of those have been made into anything yet or been approved. It certainly would go through Mark. Would be the one who kind of comes up with the idea and decides, how does this fit into his vision for Camelot Unchained before it would go to concept art stage. Rather than me going directly to Michelle or something like that.
Yeah, of course.
I guess that kind of answers the question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. One thing I've been wondering about that kind of has to do with just general lore creation as well. How much, assuming any does exist, how much existing lore is there that we don't know about?
That's a really hard question to answer, actually. So there's some amount that I have in my notes that has never seen the light of day. There's some amount that Mark knows that he's shared with me that hasn't been published, or is still in process, or still being talked about, or is on pause while we get into beta. And then there's another chunk of a completely unknown size that Mark hasn't shared with me, or you, or anybody. It's a big secret. And so there's enough. There's a good amount.
So
that is
on that part. Did Mark? I don't know if he shared that or not, but lore is a big part of CU. Has Mark planned not just for the DLCs in terms of gameplay? Has he planned the evolution of the story, or I think that's actually a point that Vellic might. I might be jumping the gun, but will there, or has he left some liberty for the community to influence the evolution of the world of CU?
Both.
Okay.
There's some amount that Mark has thought about. I mean, you're asking me questions about what's in Mark's head.
That's
so.
That's why I said
know,
he might not have shared it.
Going to this.
Yeah.
And there's, because of the nature of the kind of game that it is, there's a certain amount that's, left up to, this is your story, as I wrote on the lore landing page on our website. This is where you write your tale in the letters of fire and the tomes of history, which is a bit purple prose, but
it's still nice to read.
That's the kind. Oh, thank you. But that's the kind of game that it is. So both.
I did want to ask a follow-up to my question, which was, you didn't mention any having already been written, like formally written and just not put out publicly. And so what I was wondering is, has there been any concern about not being able to get enough of the actual world lore out before the game releases?
Not really. I mean, in what sense? Like,
well, I mean, I know some of the game concepts from the Kickstarter mention finding things about the old world and about some of the causes of the cataclysms in the depths and other things in the world and such. And so I assume those things will have to obviously be written up. And so I kind of wonder. Obviously, you will have finite time leading up to launch to actually get those things written, and they'll be hidden somewhere until we discover them in game or whatever. And so, I was wondering.
You want to know if those have been written?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at. Is how has some of that already kind of been written and is just stashed away somewhere, going, waiting for to be put in game, I guess.
Well, not by me.
Okay.
I'm sure I will be working on that at some point, but we're not there yet. And there's plenty of becoming stories still to work on, and there's also let's not forget about the to be stories, which are the class background stories.
Yeah.
Yes.
Those are going to be interesting also to write. Have you started on those, or even just thrown out some ideas on the paper, or is it right now completely on hold and nothing has been worked on yet?
I have an ideas file on my computer. It's just everything that I jot down during the day. Mm-hmm. It's over 200 pages long.
Okay, so you have some things already.
Those aren't all necessarily about to be stories.
Yeah.
Yes, I have done some thinking about that, and I think I went so far as to create a pitch for a new for one of the to be stories. Trying to remember. I think I started creating a pitch for both a rewritten or a new Hellbound story, which is really the only. It's listed under becoming on a website because it would be the only to be a story, but the Hellbound, which was the only class that had a background story written for it or background stuff written for it. And also, I think I started on one for the Flame Warden.
Okay.
But I don't think either of those made it all the way to mark yet.
Odovic had an interesting question here. Given the game is rated 18 plus, has the adult-only audience given you freedom to explore a wider range of story topics?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that was kind of one of the things when I first came to CSE. There's a whole actually funny story about this. But definitely a lot more adult themes, a more mature kind of content has opened up a lot of possibilities, and a lot scarier stuff and more dramatic stuff, and more grown up and difficult themes that I haven't really had the opportunity to write about in the past before CSE.
You might have saved you a headache for the depth also. Because trying to write the depth for an audience under 18 might have been hard.
You couldn't have the depths without it, without that stuff. I mean, it's based on Giger and Lovecraft, and maybe a little more Giger sometimes, but absolutely. I mean, when my first, I mean, I knew that from the beginning that this was going to be an opportunity for that kind of writing and those kinds of stories. The writing samples that I submitted at the beginning contained like my most mature stuff that I'd written to that date, including like some kind of like fantasy horror type stuff. And I think that, that was part of why Mark got interested. It's like, okay, he kind of gets this.
To transition a little bit back to something Kriss started to bring up, which was kind of on my topic list. We don't review topics ahead of time. We just kind of have it be sporadic and spontaneous. Surprise.
In case anyone's wondering, I haven't seen any of these. We talked about maybe giving me the questions ahead of time, but that didn't actually happen.
Yeah, true.
Brand kind of mentioned it, but I wasn't sure if you just wanted the general topic ideas or the actual questions or what, and we never really work that out. So
nope. Coming to this totally a blank slate.
One thing I did want to ask you about that Kriss kind of brought up, and I'm not sure if y'all have this worked out yet or not, but have you discussed how you can build on the existing lore post-launch and add that into the game without the PvE experience? How do you do that in a PvP game?
Nope. We have not talked about lore post-launch of the game, the live game. Not at all. There's plenty of lore that needs to flow under the bridge before then.
Yeah, true. I guess what I was wondering about was the ideas of how it can actually get into the game, but specifically, I guess. Has there been any, and this may also be nope, been any discussion on how you integrate developing lore from your own perspective, as well as allowing players to impact the actual game by just existing in the game and doing things?
I mean, that also would be a better question for Mark. Because it involves the design of the game and game mechanics and vision for the game. I have ideas, but they're just my ideas.
Okay, well then here's one that I think you probably can't answer. And this is something that's kind of this is my question, because I think this is something that's really important for roleplay in an MMO. Are there currently plans, and perhaps, I guess, to what extent, to work on existing game lore, specifically pertaining to the addition of new important NPCs and game locations that will exist in the game?
Is there a plan to work on that stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, not that we've, again, talked about. A lot of that is still, something that evolving. Some of that stuff hasn't even gone through the concepting stage yet.
Yeah.
We're building a game. Yeah, exactly. We're building a game from the ground up, we're getting there. We'll get there, but. At the moment, that's not something that's really on the radar.
Yeah.
There's one thing I did want to ask, I guess, to give you a bit of a break, perhaps, and to get chat chimed in a bit more is.
All right.
Though they've been really active today, is talking more about what we want to see in the game lore, what kind of things we would like to see in the game. And that's one of the things for me, as I mentioned, I think that's kind of important for RP, is having some of those built-in lore NPC characters, besides just the kings, who you can look at and you can reference in your own character storylines and things, and be like, and there's an NPC you can talk to or maybe interact with, or that gives quests or whatever, and you can you can work those into different RPs and stories of your own devise, the players can anyway, and as well as location stories, so that we can go have a roleplay event at a specific location, and it has its own background, and we know that certain things happen there, and it's a kind of
we know about the places of power for that, at least. So that's one of them.
There certainly could be, in terms of characters to reference for the purposes of RP. I would recommend you take a look at the list of characters in CU lore on the wiki. And Well, always need volunteers for the wiki.
Well, he's
I
a volunteer
need
for the wiki already.
I am, but I
know,
haven't
I know.
updated in a while. I need to.
Yeah. I gotta. Somebody's got to put the last newsletters on there.
Yeah, I switched jobs and everything and haven't touched it in a while, and I need to come
Yeah.
back, go back to updating.
But there is a list of characters on there in reference to what story they came from, with a short description. So, I mean, yes.
Okay.
And then there's one thing, same to give a bit of a break to Max, but something that actually came into my mind yesterday when watching the Q&A and reviewing the beta doc about the campaigns. The idea that there could be some lore keepers, players that could create missions and stories that can be integrated into the lore of the game. So the lore keepers volunteers validated by CSE, whose missions could be integrated into the lore, basically becoming DMs inside the world of CU and creating an actual campaign in the terms of pen and paper RPG with a follow-up missions, follow-up stories, and things like that. Is it something that you think could be possible?
I think it would be super cool, but you'd have to ask Mark.
Yeah.
I mean, that's vision for the game type of stuff. I can't really speak to that or what do you think? It's a question that's come up on a few Q&As though, and he's talked about how that would be cool, but it's not like something we're thinking about or talking about.
Yeah, of course. But yeah, because when I read about the campaigns and all the mission system, it really made me think of the campaign creator as basically a DM in a pen and paper RPG.
Yeah, I think that's part of Mark's thinking.
Yeah, and so having those missions rather than being temporary just missions just for XP and loot, being actually lore oriented more than loot and XP oriented, and tying into the game lore.
It would be cool.
I will say, on that note, that is, though it's kind of in an informal way in that game, that is one of my favorite parts of EVE Online, is how just renowned the different in-game events for players become for some of them. And they essentially, even though the developers don't really necessarily have to facilitate it actively, though they do seem to support it to some degree, but just because of how it develops, a lot of those become essentially the lore of the game itself, and those are
regularly
really
you hear
cool
about the last huge war that broke out in EVE,
or the last time someone stole their entire bank worth of resources.
Like the whole economy of some real world countries spent in just waging war in the game.
Yeah. It's cool stuff.
It's good stuff. Now, last fragment on my previous question. Kriss, of course, knows the one piece of lore that I really want more than any other one, which I mention occasionally in your streams.
Just
Sturm lore.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Sturm are mysterious, and they are somewhat mysterious even to me, because there's stuff about dragons that Mark is keeping very close to the chest, even from me, and the Sturm are, clearly have some sort of connection to that. But what that may be and how it works, I don't know yet.
He's not ready to reveal that
but that's going to be a really fun story to write.
On a similar topic, that totally improvised question, is it ever difficult to work on lore when there are some fragments that only exist within Mark's head? I assume the answer was yes, but
I mean, of course. There's, before I came to CSE, there was already a body of work that existed. And, a big part of my job has been kind of taking that, running with it, and developing, we call them the developed versions of the stories. Certainly the dragons being the biggest piece that's missing even for me. But occasionally, there'll be things like, working on when I was developing the Tales of the One True City stories, which is more world lore, not the Becoming stuff. Or maybe it even popped up in the Golem story, but I made reference to Arthur's sword, and one of the things I had to change in the story was Mark said, no, I have something special I'm doing with that.
Okay, so sometimes when he reviews your Becoming stories, he literally tells you, this won't work, but I can't tell you why.
Exactly. It doesn't.
Just take the sword out.
that makes it really hard to write.
It's a good challenge.
I imagine.
Part of the job is, and from the very beginning, what's always been, take these ideas and run with them, develop them, make them fully fleshed out, make them into proper stories with a beginning, middle, and end, a slowly rising conflict that reaches a climax and a resolution. Descriptions and writing craft. So that's just what I do. That's part of what I do here at CSE, is take the parts of the lore and the stories, which is, most of it, and develop it and run with it and make that come alive. But there are things that aren't ready for my writerly touch yet.
Branching on that, before you came to work to CSE, you had written books.
Yeah.
The difference between writing a book and writing the Becoming story, was it hard to actually do the transition? Because it's really different. It's not even writing a novel or just a story. You have to really think about all the implications, because there's implications in the game after that also in what you write. So how hard was it to make the transition?
Some parts were hard and some parts were easy. What you're referencing is I wrote the novel Pandalay, which is a high fantasy novel for like young adults. It doesn't have, blood everywhere and the really dark stuff. It doesn't have any of that. It doesn't have the depths in it. It's a very different genre in a lot of ways. And I love Pandalay, and I love that genre. I'm very proud of what I did. It was optioned to be made into a film at one point. The film didn't happen, but it was pretty cool. It was super cool to go through that experience. Transitioning to writing in a different style, that was interesting. Learning Mark's style, and just the style appropriate to the world of Camelot Unchained. It took me a little while, but that was more fun than challenging, really. It was a challenge, but a fun challenge. Writing a novel like Pandalay is a really lonely process. You know, there's nobody but you, and it's all in your head, and it's all garbled when it comes out on the page, and you are the one who has to read it and judge it and decide if you like it and if you think it's good. It's a lot more collaborative working at CSE. Not necessarily, and like, I mean, I sit at my desk and I write stories, but you know, it's Mark's vision. It's Mark's idea of Camelot Unchained. It's dependent on, as you mentioned, all these other stories that already exist. It's a whole body of work that it links up to, and I enjoy that. I enjoy being less lonely. Sure, I mean, sometimes that has its own challenges, just like working, you know, in a collaborative manner always does. But they're mostly good challenges and fun challenges. And I guess, yeah, I guess I wouldn't call it too difficult to change over. It's mostly been a fun kind of challenge to do.
Right.
Speaking of connection, because I think it's actually a pretty interesting question, Ulvik is asking, have you had much crossover within Becoming Stories, things that confuse the reader until they read a later story or another race's Becoming Story? So things that tie in between different Becoming Stories.
I mean, in some ways, you tell me if you find that happening. I mean, the answer, you know, if the question is has that been deliberately woven in some cases, yes. In many cases, yes. Some of that is certainly there's of course there's crossover between the Becoming Stories in that they're all in the same world, but there's also certain characters, particularly the kings, who may appear in one Becoming Story as a more background kind of character, but are a lot more present in another story. And, you know, you have that context. If you've read the other one of, well, they're this kind of a person to these people, and they're this kind of a person to these people. I'm certainly thinking of King Arthur in that he's kind of appears as this battle commander in the Golem story. Not to give you any spoilers, but you know, there's a lot more of the personal inside his head stuff going on in the Tales of the One True City. Plus, if you've read the Ketchi Becoming Story, there's a whole other
interaction.
There's a whole other interaction and relationship that is hinted at or dealt with or begun in that story. So yes, absolutely. There's layers of things that go between the stories. At the same time, part of the challenge of writing them and part of the fun of writing them is to make each Becoming Story, and this is something that I lay on myself as a writer, to make each story a self-contained unit, a self-contained story, and that it's a good story to read if it's the first story you've ever read from the lore of Camelot Unchained, and it's rewarding to read if you've read every other story at one and the same time. That I don't always succeed at that, I don't think, but that is always something I'm thinking about.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, it's definitely good because you don't want to go into a story and it's just not entertaining in and of itself.
Yeah, because
especially when they're not all out and they don't come out all at one time. So you come in and one doesn't come out for a while, and then you come back to it, and you're like me, and you have a terrible memory. You don't remember, even if I've read some of the other stories, and I don't remember them.
Well, it's probably also confusing because some of them have been rewritten versions of stories that already existed, and others are totally new. So yeah, that's probably
we should class them by age rather than just by the races. The ones that have been written or not.
We could, but I think I think it's more about where we end up. If we end up with a body of lore that all works together and it's all good, than about like, wait, I feel like I've read this before, but it's different. But I feel like I know what's going to happen. Oh, yeah. I mean, all right, but like one day, maybe you can force yourself to forget, like Vellic.
Oh, he doesn't need to force himself.
No, my memory's just terrible. I did want to ask you a question from Brand, since he couldn't be here.
All right.
I got it. He actually gave me 2 questions, but the other one kind of sort of has to do with the live game, so I don't think you're going to be able to answer that one, so I'm just going to skip to this one. And that is kind of a depths question. But going in terms of your board game that you're working on, is there any sort of, since that's supposed to kind of take place at a different time than the live game itself?
Yes, the board game, yeah.
Yeah. Is there any kind of lore or anything that's going to be kind of exclusive to that, or story that's going to be exclusive to that board game that won't necessarily be revealed in the MMO?
Maybe. I mean, the lore of the board game is something that is really just like me going off and doing my own thing, because it does not take away any time. And I always emphasize this, but it's really important. It doesn't take away any time from people who are working on beta 1 critical things.
Yeah.
So I guess it's possible that could happen. I'll tell. It's not something that has been written or planned out at this point. But I will tell you this: the term for people who go into the depths, delvers, that arose out of the board game and has been backwritten into the lore of Camelot Unchained.
Kind of fed in the opposite direction.
Mm-hmm.
It would be nice if the board game was just like your Becoming Stories, where the board game, you don't need the board game to understand the lore of CE.
Yeah.
But if you have the board game and play it and read the lore of the board game, it's rewarding because you learn more about the depth from the lore of that.
Yeah, I mean that unless we want to do something extra funky special, that would be the goal.
Okay.
And that they would be self-contained units that are fun and internally consistent on their own, but work together if you are into all or both.
Part of the you don't need to read the prequel to understand the book.
Yeah.
But if you have the prequel, you understand more things about the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that was probably the thinking Brand had with the question, is trying to see just if the board game might have stuff that would further enrich the story of the MMO, perhaps.
Absolutely. And I think there may not necessarily be lore that is totally exclusive to the board game in the sense that
Mm-hmm.
I'm not, at least at this moment, planning on writing like, this is a novel of the Depths board game, but not of Camelot Unchained. Like I don't see that really happening. I don't see that it's very likely. I mean, part of the reason that I have set the board game in ages past, prior to the MMORPG Camelot Unchained, is because I wanted to include characters from all realms, and you have to work together because it is a semi-cooperative game in the longer version, and definitely cooperative in the boss fight module, or whatever I end up calling that. So just as in the Silverhand's Becoming story, and in the Great Depths Raid story, which, that, by the way, yes, that was a story written because I was working on the board game, and to flesh out the depths. And that's where the term Delver was invented. For this game. So that's actually a really good example of something to answer Brand's question, in that it is for both. It grew out of me working on the board game, but it is, part and parcel. It's part of the fabric of Camelot Unchained's lore.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to completely change gears here.
All right.
With a totally different sort of question. Now, we know that within the lore, the emissaries arrived and they kind of sort of made everyone like immortal. Unless you recanted that, I don't think it did. I think it's still in there, right?
Wait, sorry. Say that again. I just kind of broke up for like a second.
It's still kind of in the lore that the emissaries essentially came and kind of sort of made everybody like immortal, right? Because I remember reading that at one point. Yes. Okay. So, building on that, because I think that's the only time it's really been referenced. Have y'all worked on? Because I know that certainly the mechanics I know are not worked in, but have y'all considered or worked on how lore-wise you explain people dying on the battlefield and then coming back?
Aside from the fact that the emissaries made us immortal.
Well, I mean, they're immortal, but they obviously don't stand right back up on the field, so...
Not at all. I mean, that's a good example of something about where, because people often ask, like, does the lore inform the mechanics, or do the mechanics inform the lore? And the answer is always both. Because for some things, it just makes sense. Like, are these people particularly good at something? Well, that's kind of lore based. But how do the resurrection mechanics work? Well, that's going to inform the lore. And so that's not something that they have, I'm sure they've thought about it and worked on it. I know they have. But Ben and Mark haven't, laid that out yet. And so when that is decided, then that'll inform the lore. So that's a good example of that happening.
Yeah, it certainly makes...
like the Banes and Boons also are probably also that kind of mix. Some of them were more mechanics based. And did your Becoming story inspire some of the Banes and Boons? I suspect.
Yes.
Also. Yeah.
Sometimes Ben will ask me things like, what does it say in the story for these folks and whatnot, and then give him inspiration to
create a Bane or
a Boon, and then it happens in the reverse direction sometimes too.
Okay.
Yeah, and it certainly makes sense. I mean, you want to be faithful to the lore that exists and everything, but it's still a game. And so to a certain extent, you want to follow that and be faithful as much as you can, but you hit a certain point where, you have to go by what's best for the gameplay. You can't necessarily. I can understand how you can't necessarily just work lore in there just for the sake of lore. It has to fit with the actual enjoyable gameplay. From kind of a reverse, I guess, almost a reverse direction of that. If there was a while when I had more time, also when I was updating the wiki more actively, where I was working on, where I wrote a number of little fanfics for CU and posted them on the forums and everything. And
Cool.
One of the problems I came in there was the immortality thing. I was writing the story and I was like, wait, how do you make any of these characters matter worth a damn if they can't die? Like, how do you do that in a story? How do you make anybody care or anything dramatic happen if all these people respawn and just go do it again? And I was sitting there like, oh my god. And finally I was just like, you know what? They have to die. There has to be a way for them to die in the story. And so I'm going to BS it and say that these other people have some sort of perverse magic that can make them die permanently because it has to happen.
Well, there's lots of death in the lore of Camelot Unchained, but I would, for more of a sense of that sort of thing and how it works in the lore, I would direct you toward the Silver Hands Becoming story, where if you saw part 5 or heard me read it on stream, or was it in part 4? Yeah. A previous part of the Silver Hands Becoming story, the character of Nimue dies in the depths. But if you know what happens later, she might come back.
Resurrection confirmed.
Just walk back in the camp.
Speaking of time, however, I forget how long do we go?
We're pretty much at our usual. We don't usually have a hard stop, but we're pretty much at our time. Do you have a time when you really absolutely have to go?
I can stay a little bit longer. Maybe we can do.
I'll do like one more question.
Somebody's going to come and knock on my door at some point in the next, sometime soon, and then I'm going to have to stop.
Okay.
All right, Kriss, do you have any other questions you were really wanting to ask? Because I think we can have in with like one more good question, then we'll use our usual just chill minute after that.
I've mostly asked the questions I had. The most of the questions, the further questions I have, are probably just not been worked on yet. So I'll just reserve them for when we have the next stream about the lore, when it's a bit more advanced.
It'll be a pleasure to be invited back.
Yeah,
there's never one final really good question sitting in chat that
well, let me look at the chat. I don't know.
One that you probably can't answer, but not because it hasn't been thought of.
I have tons of those.
We know there's going to be more races by launch time and after that. Have you started working on those becoming toys? Or are they first fleshing the races up more before giving them to you?
I have, generally speaking, they're fleshed before they come to me and I write a story. But I have some pitches for races sitting around waiting for the right time and stuff like that. I mean, that's really the only answer I can give.
Yeah, of course. No. I completely understand.
I do want to
ask, what lore do you think is more important to the game, the written lore or the living lore of the game driven by player actions? Whichever one makes it more fun for you.
True.
Of course, it's flattering if whenever people say like, Max, your lore is really inspiring or really makes it fun to play the game. But if it's the lore that you create for yourself, for your own character, or for our monthly newsletter contests, or every other month, then if that's what makes it fun, if that's more important to you or makes it more fun for you, then I say have at it.
That is one of the areas where technology makes me very sad. Because I think one of the reasons that, as I mentioned, I like a lot of things in EVE Online, and I bring them up somewhat frequently on our cast. And even though I don't play it anymore, and I haven't played it for ages, and I refuse to ever give them any more money because they canceled my MMO I wanted. But anyway, I'm I'm not bitter.
Not at all.
But one of the things that I think makes them able to have these player events be so impactful and actually kind of become a part of the game's lore in a way is that they have the single server technology, because everyone's in the same game world, so everyone experiences those same events. And when you have multiple servers, there's not it just seems like there's not really any way that developers can actually do that and go like, that happened on the server, that's cool, now it's a part of the lore, because then every other server's like, what are you talking about?
Right.
That didn't happen.
That's interesting.
But that's like my favorite thing about Eve, really, is that everything that happens is kind of a shared experience for everyone.
That's cool.
Anyway, cool. I do want to thank you for coming out and joining us and spending an hour and plus time, hour and a half or so, with us, answering all of our questions. Some awesome and some inane and annoying, I'm sure.
No, not at all.
I do also want to thank everybody in chat for coming on and being really active and asking us lots of really good questions. We will, because we didn't have an episode last week, and that was when we were supposed to have an episode, and we skipped for this week. We will have another episode Saturday. So in 1 week, we will do another episode, and this time we're going to talk about social and guild systems, the doc that just came out.
Why would that be a topic?
That is definitely going to be the topic we're talking about, so hold your questions and or rants, as I know one or two people probably will.
Probably.
For then, and we will be back here in a week to talk about all of that. If you're watching this after the fact on YouTube, don't forget to like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff, or leave comments or questions. I'll come back in and answer whatever I can, or refer you to the Reddit page or something, because people sometimes ask questions there. But thank you again.
Or to the wiki.